Welcome everyone to the 7th episode of the In Conversation Roundtable discussion. Diverse perspectives, one solution. We're going to be exploring the journey to ban engineered stone in today's discussion. My name is Carmel Williams, and I'm Director for the Centre for Health and Policy's Research Translation. And I'm also the founding director of the Centre for Health and the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre on Health and Policy's Implementation. The centre is jointly based at Adelaide University School of Public Health and Health Translation SA in the South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute. Before I begin and we move into today's discussion, we'd like to take some time to provide an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Centre for Health and Policy's Research Translation, the University of Adelaide, the Australian Institute of Health and Safety, and the Mining and Quarrying Occupational Health and Safety Committee acknowledge the traditional custodians of country all throughout the world. We acknowledge their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Indigenous peoples among us today. So just to provide you with a little bit of background about the In Conversation Boundary Spanners series, we've developed this a few years ago with the aim of trying to raise the profile of topical and challenging societal problems. The In Conversation, Boundary Spanners, Thinkers and Policy Actor series, it really looks at not just these challenging societal problems, but it also hoping to pose solutions with the aim of helping to progress understanding across research, policy and practice communities and assist in moving each of these issues forward through increased collaboration and thoughtful action. And here on the slide, you can see how we go about doing this is by trying to bring together diverse perspectives to elevate discussion on these emerging issues. We want to present the evidence from a diverse range of perspectives, and we want to consider the desirability and feasibility of potential solutions. We've partnered today for this conversation. We've partnered with the University of Adelaide, the Australian Institute of Health and Safety, and the Mining and Quarrying Occupational Health and Safety Committee to convene the 7th in the series, in the Roundtable series. And we've titled today's conversation, Diverse Perspectives, But One Solution, The Journey to Ban Engineered Stone. The decades-long journey of engineered stone in Australia has been a collective effort involving multiple stakeholders. And in this conversation series, we'll take a deep dive into this issue, summarising the key challenges and actions taken by these stakeholders over the years. It brings together individuals and representatives from organisations that played pivotal roles in the process and aims to uncover the journey, challenges and public policy making levers that led to this really critical reform. Ultimately, today's conversation is to map how different stakeholders contributed to this process and to extract key lessons that can inform other public policy-making efforts aimed at fostering positive societal changes. We're really very privileged to have a range of important roundtable speakers and expert panellists join us today, and I'm pleased to introduce each of them to you shortly. And each will share their perspective on the topic for a few minutes each. And then following the 4 brief presentations, we've allocated time for discussion and dialogue between the speakers. And we're keen to hear your questions. So please pop your questions in the chat. And if time allows, we'll certainly raise those questions and pose those questions to our really expert panelists. So today's presentations and discussion is going to start with Professor Dino Pisaniello. Dino is an adjunct professor in occupational and environmental hygiene at the University of Adelaide School of Public Health. He is the past Australian Secretary of the International Commission on Occupational Health and the past President of the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists, and he is the current Chair of the College of Fellows of the Australian Institute of Health and Safety. Dino will be followed by Shelley Rowett. Shelley has decades of experience in occupational health and safety field under her belt. She's the current Executive Officer to the Mining and Quarrying Occupational Health and Safety Commission, McQuash, and utilising Silicosis Fund for health screening and dust prevention activities, and a government occupational hygienist, but formerly the Chief Advisor for Work, Health, Work Environment and at Safe Work SA during the development of this policy position that we're exploring today. Dr. Shandini Ramakissan is a multidisciplinary researcher with expertise in occupational hygiene, occupational and environmental health at Adelaide's Exposure Science and Health Unit, which is based in the School of Public Health at the University of Adelaide. And today's final speaker in the panel is Kate Cole, OAM. Kate's an engineer and scientist working to protect the health of workers across some of Australia's most iconic infrastructure projects. For her service to workplace health and safety, Kate was awarded the medal, the OAM, of the Order of Australia, and included in the COVID-19 honour roll in the 2022 Australia Day's honours. And finally, today's session will be summarised by our raconteur, Associate Professor Sharon Gaskin. Sharon's a Director of Adelaide Exposure Science and Health based at the University of Adelaide. Sharon's field of expertise is in occupational environmental health, with her research program exploring the pathways and impacts of environmental and occupational hazards on human health and society. This leads to the development of effective interventions to control and prevent exposure to hazards. So thanks to all of our lovely speakers. It's really great to have so many of you here today. And to kick off today's roundtable session, I'd just like to set the scene a little bit with a tiny bit of background information about why engineered stone is such a significant health issue and why the 2023-24 reform was such an important and impactful research to policy case study. Many of you may be aware that silicosis is an ancient disease and is usually primarily affected stonemasons and miners. It has recently made a troubling comeback. There's been a surge in cases in Australia and around the world, largely tied to engineered stone fabrication. This new form, called accelerated silicosis, is more aggressive and can develop quickly after relatively short exposure, leading to severe and irreversible lung damage. And unfortunately, there is no treatment other than lung transplantation. So Australia declared silicosis as a public health crisis because it was affecting very young workers, causing life-threatening consequences. Continuous research and advocacy at the state and national campaigns have worked together to raise awareness and push for action, and has seen various sectors and stakeholders playing crucial roles in addressing this public health threat. These efforts culminated in the Australian government's decision in late 2023 to ban the use, supply and manufacture of engineered stone. But this journey wasn't straightforward. And so today's panelists will discuss and explore how they've gone about this journey. We'll take a deep dive into the roles of different stakeholders, discuss the challenges, opportunities, and we'll draw out the key lessons that can be learnt from the journey of engineered stone and the banning of it, and how we might be able to draw on these lessons for other research and policy practice translation projects in the future. It's a great example of how evidence and research can be, with the right advocacy and the right investments, really lead to significant impact and improvements of health and wellbeing of the population. What will happen now, I'm going to invite Dino to provide his presentation, and when Dino is completed, he'll hand on to the next speaker, and so you'll see me again when we're at the time for questions. And please do, I want to remind you, please put your questions in the chat. We're really keen to respond to the issues that you raise. Now, Dino, can I please invite you to set us off with the beginning of this, understanding this journey?
Thanks, Carmel. Hi, everybody. For the next 5 minutes or so, I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on what Carmel has said as the background to this case study of research to policy. Next slide, please. So it's fair to say that the banning of engineered stone in Australia was the outcome of an occupational health problem becoming a high-profile public health problem, and for that matter, an industrial relations problem and a political problem. So this does happen from time to time, and it developed relatively quickly as a product of the acknowledged regulatory failure and powerful advocacy for increased regulation. Occupational health has its origins in public health, and the progress that we've seen in occupational health and safety can be considered one of the success stories in the last 100 years of public health. The book title on the left there, The Advocacy and Action in Public Health, was written by the University of Adelaide in conjunction with the Commonwealth Department of Health, and it has a chapter on improving health and safety at work. So there is a section in this book that actually relates to work health and safety. One of the key ingredients for success in this area is that the responsibilities and duties of different stakeholders were allocated in separate statute legislation. So the employers had to provide safe and healthy workplaces and safe systems of work. Employees had to work in as a safer manner as possible, and suppliers, designers, and manufacturers had to provide safe products and accurate information about the safe use of materials and equipment. Next slide, please. Now, as Carmel's mentioned, silicosis is a serious lung disease associated with working with granite, marble, and many other stones. The problem's been known for a long period of time. Way back in Egyptian times, cases of silicosis or lung disease associated with work with stone emerged. But with the advent of pneumatic power tools in manufacturing, mining, and tunneling in the early 20th century, the dust levels became extremely high and the rates of silicosis were alarming. However, with improvements to occupational hygiene, so things like ventilation, wet methods, respiratory protection, silicosis became less important as an occupational disease. Next slide, please. However, in 2010, there was a resurgence of silicosis associated with a new artificial stone product, also called engineered stone or manufactured stone. The situation was labelled as a public health crisis, as Carmel has alluded to, as it was affecting relatively young workers with very serious outcomes. The disease prevalence was most prominent amongst those fabricating engineered stone benchtops, which, as you know, were very popular in Australia and still are popular due to the diversity of colour and pattern options, as well as being generally of lower cost than marble or granite. The interesting facet of this particular problem was that the work was done mostly in small workshops that were rarely visited by health and safety inspectors. In addition, the skill level required to work with these engineered stone products was less than that for traditional stonemasons, and many workers were coming from non-English speaking and migrant backgrounds. So there's a photograph on the bottom right there illustrating some of the nationalities of these workers. And in general terms, in Asian culture, workers don't ask too many questions. They accept what the boss is saying. So this problem emerged partly as a vulnerable population issue as well. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, there was a need for research to address this issue. And initially, it's mostly in epidemiology, in toxicology, and also in material science. So the material science aspect, which Shelley will allude to, no doubt, was conducted on new materials, as well as epidemiological research and toxicological research was conducted. The interesting thing about engineered stone is not just inorganic material, it's also organic as well. and it was a potentially new kind of hazard compared with traditional stone. Next slide, please. Here's a few papers that were generated as a result of this research supporting the evidence base for engineered stone. The top paper relates to a material or exposure science, which is really relating to dust emissions. The second paper relates to more of toxicology, relating to the metal ion release in artificial lung fluid, so understanding how those dust particles release their components into the lungs was very important to understand. And the third paper relates to safety data sheets. So how accurate were these safety data sheets? I'm sure that Kate and Chun-Li will elaborate on the evidence for better control as a result of this research. Next slide, please. So as a result of the understanding that we had, partly as a result of the research, but also about what was the experience in workplaces and so on, the coalition, if you like, of health and scientific organisations, including the Public Health Association, joined in advocacy to address this issue with one control option. One of the first control options was to consider reducing the amount of crystalline silica in the engineered stone. So on the hierarchy of controls, that's the green one, substituting a high silica content engineered stone for a lower silica content. That was certainly one option. The extreme option was to ban the engineered stone altogether. And this is the top elimination of the hierarchy. And this, if we had done it, and we did, was a world first. So the advocacy was supported with evidence, and it was a national campaign. Victoria took the lead in very tight regulations, including licensing of engineered stone workshops. But there was also a lot of political pressure applied in each jurisdiction, because as you know, work health and safety legislation is administered in each state and territory. But along the way, the research evidence was supporting that political pressure. And not just the evidence in terms of toxicology, epidemiology, and so on. There's also the question about how the products were used and whether they could actually be used safely. I'm now going to hand over to Shelley, who will outline the relationships and influences in this journey.
Hi. I've been asked to talk about the relationships and influences from the perspective that I saw during the time of the engineered stone ban. And first, I'm a government public servant, so I have to give my disclaimer that I am not speaking on behalf of the minister who I work for, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the regulatory authority that I used to work for. If we could show the next slide. So at the time of the engineered stone ban, there were a lot of players in the game. I've tried to create a diagram that goes through the different influencing factors, from the lobbying bodies to the government WHS people to the health area. Obviously, at the time, I saw my central world as the industrial relations ministers, the work health and safety group, because I worked for one of the state safety regulators who were discussing the issue through the government occupational hygiene regulators group. So just to put a bit of perspective on how legislation and regulations work in work health and safety. Nationally, we have harmonised regulations that Safe Work Australia are suggested as model regs, but each state then puts those through Parliament into their own laws. The Government Occupational Hygiene Regulators Group works for the heads of workplace safety authorities, which is the safety authorities without their influencing groups of unions and employer representatives. Safe Work Australia is the formal policy-making group that advises the industrial relations ministers on actions they think they should be taking and changes that should be made to the regulations. So across the states, we have very, very different working landscapes. We have states with large mining industry, we have states with huge manufacturing industry, and at the time in 2016, when this engineered stone issue first came to the government hygienist group, there were states that were saying this is a big deal, and then there were states like South Australia and Western Australia saying we don't know what you're talking about, we haven't seen a single case. So the landscape across that national group of industrial relations ministers is very diverse. So all the ministers received a letter from the Thoracic Society. When a letter is received to the ministers, they then go to their safety regulator for a response, and the safety regulators then come to the government hygienist group and say, is there a problem with silicosis and engineered stone? So whereas the government regulators were all saying there might be something going on, and definitely New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria was saying they were seeing cases of silicosis, other states weren't. And so then instead of having a national campaign to decide what we did about engineered stone, regulators did different things. In South Australia, Professor Pisaniello convinced the safety regulator to perform research on the issue before we went down the regulatory path. And so South Australia basically worked with Adelaide Uni to produce exposure programs. Other states like New South Wales and Queensland actually sent their inspectors out to do that monitoring themselves. So first of all, it was a fact-finding issue. Because the work health and safety regulations control respirable crystalline silica, not other substances, that was the main focus of our investigations at the time. So from my point of view as a work health and safety regulator at the time, the ban decision was predominantly made by the workplace relations ministers who at a national level made that decision. But the influences on them were quite diverse. At the same time, there was a task force that some of the government hygienists have been involved in from the health department and the federal health minister. I'm not quite sure what influence the health minister has on the workplace relations minister. As I said, as I said before, I can't decide what might have been happening there, but we can indicate that a lot of people were saying there's an issue here with engineered stone and something probably needs to be done. The investigation then was given to Safe Work Australia to champion. And from our point of view as safety regulators, I guess it was great to see everyone finally heading in the same direction on an issue which we probably hadn't seen since asbestos. But that heading in the same direction on an issue was pretty soundly based on some very good research, which Dr. Chandni Ramkissoon will tell us more about, because I think she is one of the leading influences in this decision.
Thank you, Shelley. Hi, everyone. So today I'll be talking a little bit about the role that research has played in policy reform. And I would just like to mention first and foremost, the aim of doing any research to influence policy is to provide that irrefutable scientific evidence to support the change that we're trying to see. In the case of engineered stone, as Dino and others have mentioned before, so it's been a problem for the last decade, but the first case of engineered stone-associated silicosis was reported first in Australia in 2015. So that raised alarm in a few states, and there was additional health monitoring that happened, which basically meant that we started looking for the problem. And if you start looking for the problem, chances are you're going to see the problem. So by the time it came to 2018, we had increases rates of silicosis and other lung diseases in that occupational group in Australia. And alongside that, several gaps in knowledge were identified. Because as Carmel and also Dino briefly mentioned before, so silicosis is not a new disease. It's actually a historical form of occupational lung disease associated with the exposure to respirable crystalline silica dust. But apart from the incidence and prevalence of silicosis cases in that cohort, the form of disease that was being identified in engineered stoneworkers was quite different to what was traditionally seen in other cohorts. Like Carmel mentioned before, so the disease was quite severe. That meant it progressed pretty fast to fibrosis and lung cancer, really that begged that meant that workers at a very young age, after a relatively short duration of exposure, so less than 10 years of working in that space, were being diagnosed with a severe disease. So that raised a question about what is it about engineered stone dust that is so problematic and so toxic? Some of the knowledge gaps were, what do the workers breathe in the day-to-day work that could be problematic? If we understand what sort of hazards they exposed to, that meant we can better control for them. But also, is there any treatment for those diseases? And these are the knowledge gaps that really scientific research and other forms of work needed to address. So the evidence that was generated over time to address these knowledge gaps are in multiple forms. I will touch a little bit more about the academic research because this is the role that we have as researchers within the academic setting. But equally, there needed to be data being supplied from various channels, for example, the medical channel. So health monitoring needed to keep going on. So we identify the cases coming forward, whether there were any hotspots. Equally, we needed data from industry to understand what levels of exposure the workers were being exposed to, if there had been any control measures implemented, were these effective or not. So in terms of academic research, our group at the University of Adelaide were among the first in Australia to actually show that when engineered stone is cut, the reality is the workers are exposed to various hazards. The emphasis has always been on the fact that these products has high levels of crystalline silica, which means when you process these products, you're going to be exposed to very high levels of respirable crystalline silica, a carcinogen. But through research, we managed to also show that there could be other factors that's causing the disease to be so severe. For example, like Dino mentioned, these products also contain a component of organic resin, which is a binder which binds the minerals together. So cutting those, we've shown that they could generate volatile organic compounds that have individually been associated to lung disease before. So could there be a synergism going on between these products? But that also meant that whatever control measures we are going to implement in the workplace have to cater for all these hazards. We also showed, our evidence has been cited in very important guidance document and policy reform documents, that yes, engineered stone dust is physically and chemically different to natural stone dust. And that was a very important part when Safe Work Australia came forward and asking for evidence about and recommendations to government about what should be done in this to address this issue. Is there a need to ban all the products, or can some products be banned? The reality is there is clear evidence, scientific evidence, that the products are very different to natural stone and they should be treated as such. On the medical side of things, treatment is limited. So really prevention is key in this instance. So combined together, all this over the last couple of years have provided a very strong base for a full ban on silica-containing engineered stone in Australia. All the evidence that I've talked about before really are the outcomes that have been generated over the years that have served to inform the policy. But the process that leads to those outcomes is equally as important, and it plays a role in research. So everybody knows that research doesn't happen without funding. So before the funding even happens, there are a couple of steps that are quite key, I think. So first of all, in the engineered stone case study, there were, as cases were coming forward, so diagnosed by medical practitioners, there were committees that were formed that are sort of trying to adopt a national approach to identify any cases that's coming forward, but also identify other knowledge gaps in this space. For example, in 2019, the government set up the National Dust Disease Task Force, which allowed on a national level to prioritize issues related to prevention, education, and management of relevant occupational dust diseases. And bringing together experts in a room meant that there could be more effective research priorities set, which in turn informed targeted research funding rounds. And if we draw a parallel with COVID-19, where a vaccine was developed very quickly, relatively speaking. And it's not because the research has failed in some areas, it's just there's been accelerated research and expertise pooled to get it to that point. So the process really allowed for research to be done in an effective manner. And the outcomes that came out of that then were shared on multiple platforms, which is also a very important point, and my last point before I pass it on. It's once evidence is generated as researchers, the first port of call is to publish in scientific papers, which is very important because that means it's gone through a rigorous academic peer review process. But equally important is to have that visibility on multiple platforms. For example, we've given presentations to occupational hygienists, nurses, doctors, and all these are frontliners really, who are dealing with workers, either when they're only workers or workers by the time they become patients. So it's just really sharing that knowledge and having that visibility and impact that has really helped translate that research into the policy, as we've seen it with Engineered Stone. So thank you very much. And I will just pass on now to Kate, who will also talk a little bit about the process and adopting an occupational hygiene lens. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Edney, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. I might start by explaining who we are. So the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists is the largest professional body for hygienists, which are the scientists and engineers dedicated to protecting the health of workers in Australia. And I was the president in 2022, and so my perspective or my talk today is really through the lens as being president and the immediate past president while this was happening. So we occupational hygienists are on the front line in Australia's workplaces. So every day we see the gap between assumptions and fact, or the gap between work as imagined versus work as done. Next slide, please, Nihal. And when it comes to protecting workers from silica-related diseases, there have been we have a very long history in Australia of issues with regards to the lack of control of silica-related diseases and lack of control of exposure to respirable crystalline silica. And some of the speakers today have sort of touched on some of those. Next slide, please, Neha. But it wasn't until the National Dust Disease Task Force that Chandi referred to that the engineered stone industry was really put on notice. And that was back in 2021. When people really started to seriously consider a ban of engineered stone in this country to address partly the silicosis crisis that we were going through. And while the National Dust Disease Task Force didn't expressly recommend a ban of engineered stone, they did say all parties need to consider themselves to be on notice. And that's really where this all started to ramp up. If I could get the next slide, please. So whilst industry was denying that there was a problem, occupational hygienists were in workplaces and sharing photographs with us on what these workplaces really looked like. And it showed us that work as imagined versus work as done was very, very different. And hence we saw a very large need to advocate in this area in terms of what is our skill set and how can we contribute to this really important problem. So next slide, please. So I was asked to talk about advocacy and what does it look like? Well, this is what it looks like. It's really messy advocacy. There is a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of things that happen in parallel. There is a lot of crossover, but most importantly, there is a lot of collaboration and there is a lot of speaking up. At the AIOH, we had done a lot of advocacy work during COVID-19, doing the best we could to get better health and safety precautions into healthcare and working to explain the science behind airborne infectious aerosols. And we had had some success. And throughout the pandemic, we saw the power of the media in driving that much needed accountability and change in health policy. We know that research has shown the important role of media interventions in influencing health policy because the media has a positive impact when used as an accountability tool, leading to prioritising and initiating policy discussions, and it increases policymakers' awareness and it improves, roundabout compliance with laws and regulations because you have increased awareness and focus. And historically, we as an occupational hygiene community have been relatively averse to speaking up in the media because we're scientists. It's not common for us to do this, but we have so much valuable information to contribute on issues that keep workers safe. So our role in this story was to take the time to understand where we could best contribute. And we recognized that many other stakeholders had important roles and important views. So we looked as to how we would best complement that with our expertise. So during this, we worked alongside and supported the leading voice and the leading driver of all of this, which was the Australian Council of Trade Unions. We supported them with our expertise. We worked alongside other professional bodies and other stakeholders to support them and to communicate the science and what it meant to Australian workers. If I can get the next slide, please. So in terms of what we did, we spent a lot of time reviewing and understanding the evidence. What was really going on? What did we know? What didn't we know? And what should we do about those grey areas? We commissioned a world-first survey of the experiences of occupational hygienists in Australia, and that resulted in identifying inadequate compliance with legislation and what was really happening in workplaces. So while industry is saying everything's okay, hygienists were telling it exactly how it was. And that paper, which was published, provided the much needed evidence gap on what was really going on, and it supported our submission to Safe Work Australia on the need for a ban on the use of engineered stone, amongst other things. We also focused on the policy needed to create that change. So we recommended practical ways to keep workers safe. It required us to respond to and be really nimble to the myriad of inquiries that we got from lots of stakeholders. And we spent a lot of time volunteering our important expertise to support national solutions. We know that science is only as good as our ability to communicate it. So we did a lot of media and a lot of communication, which I've mentioned as well. We also got political. So we wrote to ministers, we wrote to key decision makers in government with our information. We met with politicians, we supported and contributed to campaigns with our scientific knowledge. We volunteered our time to countless media outlets to help influence the political will to implement the practical policy options that we have put forward. So I guess at the end of it, we are scientists at heart, and we had hoped to deep down that policymakers would decisions not based on industry lobbying, but on scientific evidence. And so that's really where we focused our attention and our efforts so that our scientific voices were heard, and they were very loud, if not louder than those who were portraying a very false narrative. And we did that because we wanted to change the trajectory of the burden of silica-related diseases for workers in this country. And of course, what we did achieve as a nation is not just a ban on engineered stone, but significant public health policy reform in addition to that. So it's not just focusing on workers in the engineered stone sector, but we also have new regulation aiming to protect workers in all other industries where silica is also a risk. So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you to all the four speakers. It was really great to get this lovely background on the issue of silicosis and engineered stone, and in particular the role of workplace health and safety reforms. It was great to identify the critical role that the diverse stakeholders have all played. And then I think it was helpful to hear about how the gaps in the research were identified, and then research was undertaken to fill those information then gaps. And then I think we had Kate summarise the critical role that advocacy plays, and I think it was and very nicely positioned about how thinking about how the advocacy role is important, is collaborative and working alongside all of the other critical stakeholders and the roles and the role of the media. But now we'd like to open some questions to get the conversation, exploring these issues in more detail. I'd like to start by exploring, Kate, you mentioned the role of unions. In Australia here, we have a really robust history of unionisation and unions taking really critical roles in the industrial sector. And they brought about many benefits for workplaces that we've really, that workers and occupational health and safety and the industrial sectors gain from. So can you just talk to us a little bit, all of the speakers, please, that unions are constantly working towards improving working conditions and acting as a voice for the individual workers. So they've been heavily involved, obviously, as you've said, in the silicosis advocacy. Can you please talk to us a little bit more about the role that the unions have played in this journey and share with us some of your thoughts? And happy to start with Kate or any of the other speakers, whoever feels happy to open the conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Look, in my experience, the leadership from the ACTU was absolutely critical in order to get this legislative change. Everything from developing their own position, sort of a draft position, seeking expert advice, seeking assistance from research teams, seeking assistance from the medical fraternity, from occupational hygienists, from public health professionals, from health and safety professionals, to really help them understand what was going on, and then using that information in the way they do best, into advocating for better health protections for their workers. So for maybe 2 or 3 years now, been supporting the campaign that led to the ban on engineered stone, from things like providing scientific expertise, translating what this paper means in a real world setting, going with them to meet politicians and just speaking about our bit, because it's a whole picture. The unions have a very strong and very, very robust, group of people that know what's going on in workplaces in their section. But then, we as scientists know what's going on in our section. The medicos know what's going on in their section. And when you put us all together, it's like a huge driving force. So they were very good at bringing in the stakeholders early that were needed to help make, appropriate decisions, and very good at that advocacy piece. And when you look back at the issues of silicosis historically in Australia, we had the rock choppers, we had the sewer miners, we had the jack pickers here in Sydney, all unfortunately succumbing to silicosis. And you look at the leading stakeholder who intervened in each one of those cases, it was always the union. So it was probably unsurprising that they took a leading role in this as well, because they've always, unfortunately, had to lead in this particular area to get better protections from workers for silicosis.
Thanks. That's really helpful to position the critical role of unions in this case. Can I throw it open to Dino, Chandni, or Shelley, or Sharon? Feel free to sort of chip in too, Sharon. If you wanted to respond to the specific case of silicosis. But the other thing I'd like to explore a little bit is, do you think that this advocacy of the unions and the action that followed would be able to, can operate in other situations and other health and safety issues? And if not, why not? Can you think of other examples where the unions haven't been able to be so, and the coalition of voices haven't come together to have such a positive impact?
Yeah, I think I can start off with that one, actually. I think there are a number of ingredients here that sort of led to that effort, if you like, and also to the change. So there needed to be prima facie evidence that no one could dispute that there were cases of disease associated with the use of engineered stone, and also with silica in the past. But we also needed some evidence of overexposure. So in other words, non-compliance with what was actually already there. We also needed to recognise that this product, engineered stone, was not an essential product for Australia. It wasn't manufactured in Australia, it was imported. So a lot of it was around, why do we need engineered stone? Is this just a vanity product? Then we also had input from health experts and lawyers. So that combination, I think, was really important. Now, obviously, the Labor government, union influence, particularly the CFMEU, it was very vocal. It wasn't just the ACTU in general. It was the CFMEU. But I think as Kate said, the ACTUU had the mechanisms, had the sort of understanding the reach. They commissioned some research at Curtin University as well, which some people would argue, well, that was biased, but it wasn't really. It was supplemented by other information. And so there was evidence supporting that advocacy. Mechanisms were in place. There was a lot of things you couldn't argue with. And so I think that was the reason why it happened in this case. In other cases, it may not be all of those ingredients. So, you know, we might expect some, you know, further developments in other areas, climate change or so on, but it wasn't as crystal clear, if you like, as in the engineered stone case.
Thanks, Dino. Shelley, you've got a comment?
I just wanted to say, from the regulator's point of view at the time, it was really surprising the amount of advocacy from the unions, because when the regulators visited the majority of the work sites, they were not unionised work sites. These people generally weren't union members. So I don't know whether it was the Labor governments in the states, you know, that general caring for workers that influenced them in picking up the issue. But I think the expansion of the issue to construction and other silica exposure tasks is kind of what helped the union's appetite to carry on with its advocacy. I don't know, again, if I met a single worker actually in the small work sites in our state that were members of any union. But I think, again, the big players in New South Wales that Kate's mentioned possibly were.
It's interesting. That's another whole conversation itself, I think, about the role of unions in Australian workplaces and society. We won't explore that in too much detail today. We want to stay on task. I might we have got a question online from Richard Bowman, and he's asked, could the presence of certain types of resins have a synergistic toxic effect that has led to accelerated silicosis? So Shantini, I might throw to you, because I think you touched on this a little bit.
Thanks, Carmel. Yes, I did. And I would say there certainly is the potential of that happening. It is certainly something that we touch on in our research as well. And it's a hypothesis that we have forward, which could explain, if proven, would explain one of the reasons why disease is so severe and it's different to the traditional forms of silicosis. So when engineered stone is cut, obviously we have very high levels of respirable crystalline silica, as I mentioned, but equally our research showed that the same process can also give rise to other airborne hazards, and one of those is volatile organic compounds. And some of the organic compounds that we identified during the process are stuff like styrene, which is a common ingredient for it's a plasticizer. It's present in all sorts of resin and binders and stuff. So, and styrene in itself by itself has been linked to respiratory morbidities before. That's a similar thing we've observed with other volatile organic compounds like phthalic anhydride. But put together, you would, you know, it seems intuitive to think that when a worker is doing his thing and being exposed to all these potent airborne hazards, there might be a synergism happening. But have we tested it? Not yet.
So, I mean, I think what I hear you saying is that it is possible to respond to Richard's question, but we don't have firm evidence yet, and it requires more investigation to be able to answer that question definitively.
Yes, correct.
All right. So I have one more question that I'd like to throw to all of the panelists, and I think it's really reflecting on Australia's work, healthy and safety policy infrastructure. And that it played a really crucial role in protecting workers' health and safety through really continuous policy reforms and regulatory advancements. But I'd like you to think about these frameworks and these infrastructure and how it really has provided a foundation for us addressing the issue of engineered stone. So just a quick response, because we're coming to the end of our time. But Dino, maybe I'll ask you to respond to that question first.
All right, well, just let me unmute myself. As I mentioned, the occupational health developments started off originally in public health, but since the separation, if you like, of legislation public health has got its systems. Occupational health has sort of progressed in leaps and bounds because of all those different responsibilities that people have. So if you just look at the Public Health Act, it's 92 pages. If you look at the Work Health and Safety Act, it's 168 pages. So I would argue that we've got quite a sophisticated, detailed statute legislation framework. So we're better placed, I guess, to deal with some of these issues if the stakeholders agree.
Okay. So, I mean, that's interesting. It's a really interesting perspective. Shelley, Kate, Shani, any responses or comments to the role that the work health and safety policy infrastructure provides in addressing issues like engineered stone, banning engineered stone?
Kate, can I go first? I was just going to say, if compliance with the legislation was even 50%, then there wouldn't be issues like this. But the problem we have generally across the country is we've written some great legislation. We need compliance with it. So the doctors who first found silicosis wrote to the ministers. They didn't report to their local regulator as per the regulations, because that disconnect between the two ministerial portfolios is still a bit of a problem as I see it.
Mm. Yes, joined up policy making is something that we could also have another whole In Conversation series about. Kate or Shani?
Yeah, I guess I'll just make an observation. You know, we prior to the introduction of Roman style regulation, our regulation was really prescriptive and it was really challenging, and new laws just kept adding, you know, all the time. And that's, you know, untenable after a while. So we moved to this Roman style legislation that's got really broad general duties and broad duties, and it places, you know, the whole concept in, you know, these terms of risk. But the challenge of not having really specific regulation or specific laws is that the focus sort of moves away from those really specific items, because employers may feel that, well, if it was so important, there would be a specific item of legislation on it. And so it's this continual sort of tension between having really specific laws and having really broad general ones, which is a really sort of heated policy debate, depending on sort of what side of the fence you might sit on. And if we look at the introduction of the new crystalline silica regulations that have come in, arguably a lot of them are just the same duties, just said a little bit more specifically, which is a little bit scary when employers say to us, oh, this is all new, when indeed about half of it has already been part of their duties for a significant amount of time. So it does show that there is some value in having some really specific regulation on those items that are important to our society to protect our workers from. So even though we arguably have a very mature and robust policy infrastructure, there is always opportunity for review and improvement. And there are lots of examples where our health and safety regulators have undergone a review, and sometimes that review is less than shining and a little bit scathing. So we do need to have a process within our policy infrastructure for continuous review and reflect that just because it was written that way 5 or 10 years ago does not necessarily mean it is always suitable for today's modern society.
Well, I think what you're talking about there is the research, not the research to policy gap, but the policy to implementation gap, which is obviously a significant issue that needs a lot of attention. Shani, if you don't mind, I think I might invite Sharon to come now and provide her summary comments and provide an oversight. So Associate Professor Sharon Gaskin, can you please provide your raconteur comments to kind of summarize today's conversation before we run out of time?
Sure. Thanks, Carmel, and thanks so much for everyone and all of our speakers for bringing their unique perspective. It is a little bit of a challenge to bring together all of these and highlight the elements, but for my perspective, I've gone back to the original aim of this webinar series, which was to showcase that research to policy translation process using engineered stone as this case study to highlight the broader process and the actors involved. So as a success story, if we want to call the engineered stone ban exactly that, I thought I'd focus basically on the 4 key drivers, as we've heard from today, and I'll summarize each of those 4 really briefly. So I think that the first critical one, we've heard quite a number of our speakers mention this, relates to that work health and safety infrastructure. So Australia's long-standing work health and safety regulations and policy infrastructure, and its decades of experience and proven track record, good, bad and ugly, some might say, demonstrated that need for action, and also their proven track record allowed us to focus on that work health and safety. So that's one of the first key drivers, I think. The second relates a lot of what we've heard today, I think, to clear evidence, and from a variety of evidence sources. So as we heard our speakers say, this included academic research, but also clinical case reports, as well as the really important lived experiences shared of those affected by this illness. And I think collectively that really demonstrated a strong need for action, a coalition, if you like, everyone singing from the same song sheet, same direction movement. The third key driver I see in this success story really is around that concept of multiple actors. There were key actors here that provided important elements. The unions we've heard a lot about, also researchers had a key role. The media had a role, the professional associations such as the AIOH, and also clinicians, and collectively working in unison really to drive this message forward. Again, multiple actors singing from the same song sheet allowed this to have impact. And the fourth driver, I think, really is around that continuous advocacy, creating awareness, and not just awareness among the public, but also that really important advocacy efforts and for policymakers and those making decisions. And we saw evidence of the value of that in having those targeted research funding rounds that allowed us to develop policy relevant research questions that could be answered and used in a timely way. So beyond those 4 key drivers, I guess the other important element we've talked about today is the role of politics. And I think that certainly there were steps taken to effectively communicate that scientific evidence to politicians using accessible languages and accessible platforms, may they be policy briefs, government submissions, even media and letters. That really was key. And I think we have to really understand in this context the appetite and the decision to ban from a political perspective. This was an industry that was largely imported material. We don't have a large manufacturing industry of these materials in Australia, and so it was a stop it at the border sort of option. And I think realistically that had perhaps more political appetite as opposed to some other sensitive areas of or larger industries such as mining and tunnelling that are relevant to silica exposure. And I think collectively that role of politics, it just was the right perfect storm of elements and political will. But ultimately, I think as we've heard today, there are lots of challenges, and there were in this case too. Even in this success story, there were challenges. It's things such as industry pushback, there was strong lobbying against this ban, and there was a lot of work done to support industry for this migration into new materials. And I think certainly that means for future policy reformers, they really should anticipate and understand how to grapple with that element and challenge when striving for similar positive societal changes, such as this example illustrates. But I guess in closing, I would say that this particular engineered stone ban, the first of its kind in the world, as we've heard, the world is watching. I think it is a prime example of research translation. And I think that this roundtable discussion has highlighted that the process was not linear, that it involved multiple actors and a complex progression to get the outcome that we see today. Carmel, feel free to add anything if you think I've missed anything. Thank you.
Well, I just think that was a great summary, Sharon. Thank you so much. And just to kind of tie that little bit together about research policy translation, many of you may know of Kingdom's work, who is well regarded in the public administration literature. And he often talks about if we need to get societal change or we want to sort of see an issue get onto the political agenda and move forward, you really need the 3 Ps, which is what we've been trying to frame today. You need the problem articulated in a way that that is understandable and that speaks to multiple players and is important for multiple stakeholders. You need policy options that are acceptable and feasible and evidence-based. And then you need the politics right, which Sharon said so lovely at the end. You need the political will. And when you get those 3 Ps aligned, that opens a window and you can really get significant change. And I think that's what we've seen today with the discussion around the journey to ban engineered stone. With that, I can see we're a few minutes over time, so I think it's time to wind up. The Centre for Health and Policies, who coordinates these In Conversation Roundtables, really is delighted to bring everyone together and wants to thank all of our speakers and all of our organisations for joining us today. I want to in particular thank the University of Adelaide, the Adelaide Exposure Science and Health Unit there. We want to thank the Australian Institute of Health and Safety and the Mining and Quarrying Occupational Health and Safety Committee, QUASH. And obviously want to extend grateful thanks to Kate, Sharon, Dino, Shelley and Chandni. Just to finalise, just to let you know, this meeting is recorded, this session is recorded. The video will be edited and will be put up onto the Centre's YouTube channel, and a link will be sent out to all of those registered on today's webinar, and it will be provided to each of the organisations who are partnered with us today. We will also be summarising the key messages discussed in today's roundtable into what we consider, what we call a policy brief, to provide a really pithy document that highlights all of the issues, talks about all the drivers and proposes all the solutions to help guide future action and work in this or related areas. That will take a few months to be drafted, but that will be available probably early in 2025. Thank you all so much for today and for joining us. It's great to see so many of you still online, and we look forward to next conversations, which will be in early 2025. Thank you very much.